China first. The classic theories of modernization, written by such towering figures as Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, Henry Maine, Ferdinand Tönnies, and Max Weber, tended to regard the experience of the West as paradigmatic of modernization, as such because industrialization took place first in the West. This focus on the West is understandable, and since the explosion of productivity and sustained economic growth that occurred after about 1800 in Europe and North America was unprecedented and transformed the world into what it is today. But development is not only about economics. Political institutions develop, as do social ones. Sometimes political and social development are closely related to economic change, but at other times they happen independently. This text focuses on the political dimension of development, the evolution of government institutions. Modern political institutions appeared far earlier in history than did the Industrial Revolution and the modern capitalist economy. Indeed, many of the elements of what we now understand to be a modern state were already in place in China in the 3rd century BCE, some 1800 years before they emerged in Europe. It is for this reason that I begin my account of the emergence of the state in Part 2 with China. While classic modernization theory tended to take European development as a normality and ask why other societies diverged from it, I take China as a paradigm of state formation and ask why other civilizations did not replicate the path that it followed. This is not to say that China was better than other societies, and as we will see, a modern state without rule of law or accountability is capable of enormous despotism. But China was the first to develop state institutions, and its pioneering experience is seldom referred to in Western accounts of political development in Eurocentric histories. In beginning with China, I skip over other important early societies like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and the civilizations of Meso and South America. The decision not to cover Greece and Rome at greater length in this text requires further explanation. The ancient Mediterranean world set precedents that were extremely important to the subsequent development of European civilization, which from the time of Charlemagne onward were self-consciously imitated by European rulers. The Greeks are commonly credited with having invented democracy. They also had aristocracy, oligarchy, etc., in which rulers were not hereditary but selected by ballot. Most tribal societies are also relatively egalitarian and elect their rulers, but the Greeks went beyond this by introducing a concept of citizenship that was based on political criteria rather than that of kinship. The form of government practiced in 5th century Athens and the Athenians of Attica were under the Roman Republic as the citizens of Italia is probably better described as classical republicanism rather than democracy, since the franchise was given to only a limited number of citizens and there were sharp class distinctions that excluded large numbers of people, including the numerous slaves from political participation. These were, moreover, not liberal states, but highly communitarian, ones that did not respect the privacy of or autonomy of their citizens. The classical republican precedent, established by Greece and Rome, was copied by many latter societies, including the oligarchic republics of Genoa, Venice, the Dutch United Provinces. But this form of government had one fatal defect that was widely recognized by latter writers, including many of the American founding fathers who thought deeply about that tradition. Classical republicanism did not scale well. It worked out best in small, homogeneous societies like city-states of 5th century Greece or Rome in its early years. But as these republics grew larger enough through conquest or economic growth, it became impossible to maintain the demanding communitarian values that bound them together. And as the Roman Republic grew in size and diversity, it faced irresolvable conflicts over who should enjoy the privileges of citizenship and how to divide the spoils of empire. The Greek city-states were all eventually conquered by monarchies, and the Roman Republic, after a prolonged civil war, gave way to the empire. Monarchy as a form of government proved superior in its ability to govern large empires and was the political system under which Rome achieved its greatest power and geographical extent. I will return to the question of classical republicanism as a precedent for modern democracy in the second volume, but there is good reason for paying a closer attention to China than to Greece and Rome in studying the rise of the state, since China alone created a modern state in the terms defined by Max Weber. That is, China succeeded in developing a centralized, uniform system of bureaucratic administration that was capable of governing a huge population and territory when compared to that of Mediterranean Europe. China had already invented a system of impersonal, merit-based bureaucratic recruitment that was far more systematic than that of Roman public administration, while the total population of the Chinese Empire in the first century, the year 1 CE, was roughly comparable to that of the Roman Empire. The Chinese put a far larger proportion of its people under a uniform set of rules than the Romans. Rome had other important legacies, particularly in the domain of law, discussed at greater length in chapter 18. But although Greece and Rome were extremely important as precursors of modern accountable government, China was more important in the development of the state. Among the societies to be compared with China is that of India. India graduated from a tribal to a state-level society at about the same time as China. But then, around 2,500 years ago, it took a big detour due to the rise of new Brahmanic religion, which limited the power that any Indian polity could achieve and in some sense paved the way for modern Indian democracy. The Middle East, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, was also tribally organized. It took not just the advent of new religion, Islam, but also a curious institution of slave soldiers to enable certain polities in Egypt and Turkey to turn themselves into major political powers. Europe was very different from these other societies insofar as its exit from tribalism was not imposed by rulers from the top down, but came about on a social level through rules mandated by the Catholic Church. In Europe alone, state-level institutions did not have to be built on top of tribally organized ones. Religion is also key to the origins of the rule of law, which is the subject of Part 3. Religiosity, or religiously based law, existed in ancient Israel, India, the Muslim Middle East, and also the Christian West. It was Western Europe, however, that saw the strongest development of independent legal institutions that managed to take on a secular form and survive into the present day. The story of the rise of accountable governments in Part 4 is also largely a European one, but Europe was hardly uniform in this respect. Accountable government arose in England and Denmark, but not in France or Spain. Russia, the Rus, developed a form of absolutism, comparable in its power to that of China. The ability of certain societies to force accountability on their sovereigns then depended on a host of specific historical conditions, such as the survival of certain feudal institutions into modern times. The sequencing of political development in Western Europe was highly unusual when compared to other parts of the world. Individualism on a social level appeared centuries before the rise of either modern states or capitalism. A rule of law existed before political power was concentrated in the hands of centralized governments, and institutions of accountability arose because modern centralized states were able to completely defeat or eliminate ancient feudal institutions like representative assemblies. Once this combination of state law and accountability appeared, it proved to be a highly powerful and attractive form of government that subsequently spread to all corners of the world. But we need to remember how historically contingent this emergent was. China had a strong state, but without law and accountability. India had law and now has accountability, but has traditionally lacked a strong state. The Middle East had states and laws, but in much of the Arab part, it lost the latter tradition, that of law. Societies are not trapped by their pasts and freely borrow ideas and institutions from each other. But what they are in the present is also shaped by what they were in the past, and there is not one single path that links one to the other. The purpose of this text is less to present a history of political development than to analyze some of the factors that led to the emergence of certain key political institutions. A lot of historical writing has been characterized as ODTAA, or one damn thing after another, without an effort to extract general rules or causal theories that can be applied to in other circumstances. The same can be said of the ethnographies written by anthropologists, which are highly detailed but deliberately shy away from broad generalization. This is definitely not my approach, which compares and generalizes across many different civilizations and time periods. The overall framework for understanding political development presented here bears many resemblances to biological evolution. Darwinian evolution is built around the two principles of variance and selection. Organisms experience random genetic mutation, and those best adapted to their environments survive and multiply. So too in political development there is variation in political institutions, and those best suited to the physical and social environment survive and proliferate. But there are also many pertinent differences between biological and political evolution. Human institutions are subject to deliberate design and choice. Unlike genes, they are transmitted across time culturally rather than genetically, and they are invested with intrinsic value through a variety of psychological and social mechanisms which make them hard to change. The inherent conservatism of human institutions then explains why political development is frequently reversed by political decay. Since there is often a substantial lag between changes in the external environment that should trigger institutional change and the actual willingness of societies to make those changes. In the end, however, this general framework accounts for something less than a predictive theory of political development. A parsimonious theory of political change, comparable to the theories of economic growth posited by economists, is, in my view, simply not possible. The factors driving the development of any given political institution are multiple, complex, and often dependent on accidental or contingent events. Any causal factors, once one adduces for a given development, are themselves caused by prior conditions that extend backward in time in an endless regression. Let us take one example. A well-known theory of political development argues that European state building was driven by the need to wage war. The relationship between the need to wage war and the development of modern state institutions is fairly well established for early modern Europe, and, as we will see, applies equally well to ancient China. But before we can declare this to be a general theory of state formation, we need to answer some difficult questions. Why did some regions that experienced long-term warfare fail to develop state institutions, i.e., Melanesia? Why did warfare in other regions seem to weaken rather than strengthen states, i.e., Latin America? Why did some regions experience lower levels of conflict than others, for example, India when compared to China? Answering these questions pushes causality back to other factors, such as population density, physical geography, technology, and religion. Warfare in places that are densely populated with good physical communications, i.e., plains or steppe, and appropriate technologies, i.e., horses, has very different political effects from war in sparsely populated mountainous, jungle, or desert regions. So the theory of war and state formation dissolves into a series of further questions about why certain forms of warfare erupt in some places and not in others. And what I am aiming for in this text is a middle-range theory that avoids the pitfalls both of excessive abstraction, which is the vice of economists, and excessive particularism, the problem of many historians and anthropologists. I am hoping to recover something of the lost tradition of 19th century historical sociology or comparative anthropology. I do not conform the general reader with a big theoretical framework at the outset. While I engage various theories in the course of the historical chapters, I reserve the more abstract treatment of political development, including definitions of some basic terms, for the last three chapters, chapters 28 through 30. This includes a general account of how political development happens, as well as a discussion of how political development relates to the economic and social dimensions of development. Putting the theory after the history constitutes what I regard as the correct approach to analysis. Theories ought to be inferred from facts of history and not the other way around. Of course, there is no such thing as a pure confrontation with facts, devoid of prior theoretical constructs. Of course, those who think that they are empirical in that fashion are deluding themselves. But all too often, social science begins with an elegant theory and then searches for facts that will confirm that. This, hopefully, is not the approach that I take. There is a perhaps apocryphal story retold by the physicist Stephen Hawking about a famous scientist who was giving a public lecture on cosmology when he was interrupted by an old lady at the back of the room who told him he was speaking rubbish and that the universe was actually a flat disk balanced on the back of a turtle. The scientist thought he could shut her up by asking what the turtle was standing on. She replied, "You are very clever, young man, but it is turtles all the way down." This, then, is the problem with any theory of development. The particular turtle you pick as the starting point for your story is actually standing on the back of another turtle, or else an elephant or a tiger or a whale. And so, most purportedly general theories of development fail, because they do not take into account the multiple independent dimensions of development. They are rather reductionistic in seeking to abstract a single causal factor out of a much more complex historical reality that can have multiple causation. And they fail to push the story back far enough historically to the conditions that explain their own starting points and premises. I push the story back very far. Before we get to state building in China, we need to understand not just where war comes from, but also how human societies originated. The surprising answer is that they did not come from anywhere. Both society and conflict have existed for as long as there have been human beings, because human beings are by nature both social and competitive animals. The primates from which the human species evolved practiced an attenuated form of politics. To understand this, then, we need to go back to the state of nature and to human biology, which in some sense sets the framework for the whole of human politics. Biology presents a certain degree of solid ground resting below the turtles at the bottom of the stack. Though even biology, as we will see in the next chapter, is not an entirely fixed point. In the next section, chapter 2, we will discuss the state of nature, philosophical discussions of the state of nature, how the contemporary life sciences shed light on human nature and hence on the biological foundation of politics, politics among chimpanzees and other primates, what aspects of human nature undergird politics, and when different parts of the world were first settled.